Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining from near and far. I'm joining you all from Sacramento, California today. Um, so I am thrilled to be able to chat with you about some state policy reform here in California. Um, I'm going to share my screen really quickly. All right, you should just be seeing it all looks good from your side. Okay, fabulous. Um, Wonderful. So I am going to be chatting with you about research that we have been doing down at UCLA. We is myself, and in collaboration with faculty at UCLA, Lewis School of Public Affairs, Adam Millard Ball, Michael Manville, and the late great Donald Shoup was part of this work before he passed away this year. Um, so we miss him on this team immensely. But there was a state policy in California that passed in 2022, where the state legislature essentially nixed parking requirements near transit. And so it preempted the local government's ability to impose its parking requirements, their parking requirements. There's a lot of work around kind of the effects of parking policy reform that you might be used to, where you see a quantitative before and after study about a city, usually at least in the United States, that has reformed its parking requirements. And then we see before and after, how has this quantitatively affected parking spaces or perhaps housing units. This is going to be a different kind of talk because we were embarking on this research so soon after the state reform, the state policy went into effect. We started this the year that it went into effect. That there weren't a lot of data on the back end of that before and after study. And so what we did was we looked at the policy responses and political responses to this state law, and the state preemption of local parking reform. So this is really about the local response when the state nixes parking requirements near transit. I was worried that this would be a little bit too in the weeds, but given that we have such a diverse audience, I am going to walk through what exactly the state did in this California case. So when the state does what now? What the policy did was it affected all public agencies. So in California, that was a very big deal because it meant not only local jurisdictions like cities and counties, but also some other state agencies like a very powerful coastal commission that California has. It's for the weeds, but give me a call afterwards and we can talk about that. But it essentially said that no public agency shall impose or enforce any minimum automobile requirements on a residential, commercial, other development project if the project is located within 1/2 mile of public transit. And what does that mean? Of course, there are about 1,000 sub-bullets as to what each of those things mean. Public transit means a quote major transit stop as defined by somewhere in the Public Resources Code of the state of California. What that section of the Public Resources Code is, it essentially created a bit of a goose chase, a little bit of a scavenger hunt, I should say, through Public Resources Code. So that section of code says that a major transit stop is defined in this other section of state code, except that for the purposes of this section, it includes major transit stops that are not just existing, but are in a regional transportation plan, which essentially clues us to know that that means also future or planned transit stops that are in these plans that are created by a regional planning organization, a regional government. I'm going through this a little bit quickly, but essentially to give the indication of there are a lot of details to how this law was written and a lot of lots of places to make decisions, which will be a key point here. So what does this other section so we got from the law to section 21155 to 21064.3 to 64.3 says that so what does near transit mean for this purpose of eliminating parking requirements? A major transit stop shall mean an existing rail, bus, BRT system, a ferry terminal if it's served by bus or rail service, or the intersection of two or more major bus routes with a service frequency of 15 minutes or less during the peak periods. Different state law that came along afterwards changed that 15 to a 20-minute threshold. I'll just say there are a lot of details to actually define the nuances of this preemption of parking requirements. What we actually say in the paper that we wrote about this is it's one of those cases where the preemption law is more complicated than the law it actually preempts, that there shall be parking requirements supplied for a certain number of bedrooms or something like that for a housing unit. Okay. So there were, in fact, carve-outs to this bill as well. So essentially what we're seeing is a local government or a public agency is not allowed to enforce its parking requirements if it's within a half mile of these types of major transit stops, with some exceptions. There are carved out. So essentially to get this through the state legislature successfully. A public agency could write up findings within 30 days of a development getting proposed. That said, we think this will have a substantially negative impact and support that with a preponderance of evidence. And it would have to say that it would negatively impact meeting a regional housing need or special housing needs for certain populations. It would have a substantially negative impact on residential or commercial parking. But there was a carve out to the carve out, which was they couldn't do this, and if there were at least 20% of those units in that housing project would be affordable. Smaller projects, if there were parking reductions from other laws. I'm sort of trying to build a story about how there is a lot of detail and ambiguity built into this state law. What exactly does substantially negative impact mean, or a preponderance of evidence? That's not specified in the law. But it would be up to the discretion of the public agency writing up those findings. All right. More carve-outs to the carve-outs, or more carve-outs. Hotels type projects do not apply. This law does not apply to hotel type projects. Those still have parking that local governments and public agencies could still enforce their parking requirements for them. Employee parking at event centers could still have parking minimums. And then one that I quoted because it honestly, our research team went around and around about what we thought this meant, and we couldn't quite figure it out ourselves. So essentially, electric vehicle parking requirements are part of California code, and also many local codes, and also parking requirements, parking that is accessible to persons with disabilities. What we would think of as like ADA parking requirements in the U.S. Americans with Disabilities Act requires that there are certain parking requirements available. This law shall not preclude, I think is the language, shall not, the enforcement of parking requirements for electric vehicles or those accessible parking spaces. So there is a lot of detail to this law that ostensibly reduced parking requirements. There's a lot of texture to it and a lot of decision points. And why that is particularly important here is because you have this, can you see my cursor? Yeah, the state is passing a bill with this top-down legislation of you cannot enforce your parking requirements by writing in that little piece about how this also applies to this is near existing transit and also near planned transit, that brings into this policy implementation process this MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, that writes that regional plan. So local governments will need to coordinate with their regional government, their MPO. But it's local governments that are enacting, that are actually implementing the parking requirements in their local jurisdictions. So it's not, there is now this state law that says they shall not do something, but what we're really, how this is playing out is from that local level. It's local governments are carrying out this state law. So we wanted to go talk to those local governments, which is what we did, to see what is affecting their carrying out their implementation, what we call this bottom-up implementation of state parking reform. Because what comes into play pretty significantly are that because of all of those ambiguities that I just spelled out, major transit stops, intersection of bus routes, though how to define those are not spelled out in state law. Those are done by analysts and by planners, city by city, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So there's a large avenue for local interests and interpretation, genuine disagreement of interpretation of state law to come into play in the implementation of the state law. So we were really interested in investigating the nuances of how these govern. We looked at local governments and how they are implementing this law. How are they responding to it? And how do those local interests and their various interpretations play a role in it? So our main questions, I kind of just divulged, but how are these local governments responding to and implementing this new state mandate? We were wondering, how do they define those areas? There were a lot of details about near major transit and major transit stops, but we want to, the bill that's at, this bill was AB 2097, so you'll see that in here a little bit. How are they defining those areas? How are they measuring bus frequencies? How are they measuring distances? Have they changed local process or procedure? Did they update their local ordinances and their local laws? Or are they just acknowledging that there's a preemption of their local laws? Like, did they change their zoning code? Did they change plans or specific plans? And are they responding strategically? And if so, with what interests? What are the interests that they're bringing to the implementation process here? And then we were also interested in how developers are responding to this law, AB 2097. How has it changed the calculus about development, if it has at all? So with that, we looked at 6 different cities within California and sampled within them. We did in-depth interviews with planning directors, public works staff, public works directors, appointed officials like planning commissioners. We talked to elected officials. We have some city council members in our sample. And then we also talked to developers. To maintain confidentiality, I will not tell you exactly which 6 cities we talked to, but they were from this list. So these are all cities in California. With, for the folks who are not Californians, we were selecting for a diversity of geographic region. California is very diverse and a little bit parochial, I'll say, about what applies to what ideas apply where in the state. And then also we were looking for population size differences. Were they a central city in their metro region or more of a satellite city? We also were looking at how much development has been happening there. So would this even come into play? Would this kind of law come into play? Because if no housing had ever gotten proposed in the last year or so, or a few years, it just wouldn't have a role. They wouldn't have to even think about it much. Did they have transit was another one that we looked at. And then also this column about housing element compliance. There has been a lot of policy innovation and policy work in the housing arena in California lately. So the housing element needs to, as part of a general plan, it needs to get approved by the state housing department. And so we used, if it's out of compliance, we looked at if they were in or out of compliance with state housing law, sort of to get as flavor or litmus, a little bit of a litmus test about what is the essence of housing development in that place, and a little bit of a political measure of housing there. Yeah, so we talked to just shy of 25 folks, state agencies from local we also talked to state agency representatives, local jurisdictions was the bulk of our interview sample, as well as developers and a couple of non-governmental organizations. All right, so the parts that you came here for. This is very much a story, I've used this term before already, but a story of state preemption, where parking is a very interesting case for this. So preemption is broadly is where it's higher order government, sorry, I was just looking at the chat. A higher level of government, like a federal government or state, essentially says what a lower level government can or cannot do. It's sort of a creature of federalism. And if the preempted parties of those lower levels were doing what the state goals were, this is really where that comes into play, where there's a clash between goals of that state and local level in this case. If the local level were acting in the interests of the greater whole of the state, there would be no need for the preemption. That was not really the case in California, where there's a lot of concern about housing affordability and housing shortages, where parking was seen as this really a component that local level governments were using to get in the way of housing development, which was stymieing the state goals for affordable housing and abundant housing. So what has happened in this story of state preemption? The cacophony of responses from our interviewees was that this has induced a very large and heated debate about the definitions that I just walked us through. Even there, regardless of interest in what a city's general feel was about parking and about the state coming in and telling them what they can or cannot do, there was a very vibrant debate about how to define these areas near transit. And I'll walk through some of the details of that. And then there were strategic responses to the state preemption. And they fell into generally three key categories. The cities that saw this as an obstacle of the state coming in, telling them what they couldn't do, and essentially navigating around this law as if it is an obstacle. They see it as an obstacle to get around, or to deal with. It's a burdensome thing. There was another bin of cities that very much saw the state law as a shield. And these were more of the cities that had interest that aligned with the state law. They were interested in parking reform, but local politics often sort of got like there would be support for parking reform or for more housing at a plan level or in theory among constituents, but when it would come down to a project, there would be essentially fights at city council. And this law let those cities that had inclination towards parking reform, it gave them a shield of state law, is how a person said it. And then there was another batch of cities that used this as a springboard. They said, okay, the state told us to drop these maps of near transit and it'll eliminate our parking requirements. And I'll show you kind of the general response. I said, great, we have been given a nudge, and we're going to use this to exactly what it sounds like, springboard much further than the state law requires. And then kind of another kind of little bit of the wonkier side of it, but really about like this is the preemption in theory and in practice, really. How the ambiguity that was written into the law has led to some very large differences in interpretation of the law, and also it's allowed for pretty substantial wiggle room. And so what we see is heterogeneity around the state of how this is getting carried out. Much of that heterogeneity or those differences are, as I said, kind of genuine street level decision making that, one person says, oh, this is how we count it over here, and a different jurisdiction counts it differently. But also many are strategic decisions, as I kind of just walked through. Okay, so some of the definitional debates that I got into, given that there is a lot in the bill that opens up discussion and debate. This is a non-exhaustive list. We even have a longer list in the paper that we wrote, also non-exhaustive. But essentially, how does one define bus rapid transit? When you're measuring distance and you're pull open your geographic information system, your GIS, like analytical tools, are those stations, those bus, like rail stations even, which are fairly unambiguous in statute, are they dropped as a point, or are they an entire, what we would call like a polygon? Is it the entire station parcel? Does that parcel include the parking lots around it? Or is it just one single point dropped on a platform? And that has really big implications for the area that is subject to the law. As someone who I'm working with at UCLA, I think just ran an analysis of, don't quote me, but something like a 25% difference in land area, depending on if it's a parcel or a point being used to draw the circle. What counts as an intersection of bus routes? That was one of the ways that you would measure a major bus stop. Like how far do the stops have to be to count as an intersection? So you kind of get the idea. Lots of these kinds of analytical, an analyst discretion comes into play a lot here. The kind of juicier part of this, I'll say, is the strategic responses. And so what we were hearing from various cities was about quotes from these cities, and I'll run through them pretty quickly. But like the best example are the cities that saw AB 2097 come along, and they were already in a planning phase. That general plans is what we call the planning process in California for the city or county. It took up a bunch of the land area of the city. So the city said, let's finish the job. And they eliminated parking requirements citywide. They thought it would have been weird and hard to maintain maps with these areas. Those maps are kind of like require analyst work to maintain them. So they said, let's just get rid of this process. They were already predisposed to parking reform. So they got rid of city parking minimums entirely. And so some of these cities were, folks, the respondents here said they were pretty happy about it when it came along. They'd had a lot of incremental change was the theme among many of the cities that used it as a springboard. And that incremental change had let both the elected officials there see how it worked out and the constituents see how it worked out. So those positive outcomes that they could see on the ground in their own city really let them take this further and go much beyond, like much further beyond the state law. There were, I mentioned these kinds of cities that used the state law as a shield. And so this is one law and many other kind of pro-housing laws that have been passed in the last 5 or 10 years. And they very much used the language of using it as a shield at the project level. They can't disobey state law, so the state law gave them cover. This was a theme that we heard a lot from from cities that are kind of predisposed to to parking reform, but at that kind of project level, they've had trouble kind of actually implementing it. So this nudge of state law gave them, like, they then had to say, let's draw up the maps of what counts as near transit. And when they did that, drawing up the map, they used, here's a planner said that they used the most liberal definition of transit frequency in order to draw up more expansive maps in their city and basically have the state law apply to more of their city. And they thought that their interpretation was that best aligned with the legislative intent. There was a shield that kind of cut the other way, where some cities said they used, say, that regional agencies map to the quote T, and said that's that. Like, we are not going to reevaluate. They'll use it kind of to draw as restrictive what some developers saw as the most restrictive area as possible in their city. I'm gonna kind of let's see. Okay, and so something that we really found was that there's a new politics that came about with this. So many cities said our goal is to just be in lockstep with that regional agency and how they define areas. But this creates a really big new role for MPOs, and some of them hate having that power, is what some people said. So, this is kind of like more in the weeds than I would usually do for a interstate, international audience. But it creates a new politics around that regional plan. That plan now essentially precludes local jurisdictions parking requirements, so that puts a lot of power on those plans. That is a newfound power. It puts more teeth on them than they've ever had before. I'm happy to talk about that more offline. All right, and then there are the bins of cities that saw this as an obstacle, this law as something to get around. Some of them said that straight up. Historical Planning Commission, California has lots of local governments have lots of commissions. And developers there said this was even said on the public record. Like, how do we get around it? That was kind of the most overt that we heard. Many of the cities in this kind of bin said they had this kind of technical reasons for thinking that for seeing it as an obstacle, or at least they couch them in technical terms. Like, we have a train station, or we have the transit that qualifies us for this bill, but we don't get the transit access because that train station only has cross-country trains that come through maybe once a day or once a week or something like that. Yeah, cities that don't think that they're set up for this, I think it's more a bill that's aimed at multimodal or dense city centers like a downtown San Francisco or in LA, or everyone thinks that it's kind of, there are places out think that they're unique. There's a refrain in California law that was used a few times here: one size doesn't fit all. And there are cities that don't think that this is set up for them. There are some that just ignore the piece of the law that was aimed at the planned transit. So the way that they dealt with the obstacle is they just ignore a piece of legislation and they ignore the MPO. And that planned transit just doesn't go into their calculus of parking reform. All right. I'll look at the chat here because I think I'm getting close to time.
Yeah, in the interest of time, you can maybe go quickly through this just because we have just a few more minutes. I'd love to get some discussion in, but thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so really quickly, developers generally said this isn't going to change our wholesale calculus on parking, but this quote I think is really fun. Parking is like a pizza. You don't bake it by the slice, you bake it by the whole pie. So where it really changed was the marginal parking space that would have required, say, building a digging out a second floor of a subterranean garage. Let's say the parking ratio, which is how they're, would have required a few extra spaces that would have required a whole new level or a upper deck or something like that. If they could shave those off, that makes a really big difference for the viability of the development project. So those, like the number of parking spaces we're anticipating when we, of course, do the quantitative analysis of this, is that those differences might actually be pretty marginal, at least based on the sample that we talked to. And essentially, this was because parking was very much described by developers as an asset that they considered part of their projects. So they talked in terms like, we know that the people who will buy or rent these apartments would want parking depending on where they are. So we want to create a stabilized asset. They were building something that they wanted to have market viability. But what it also really did was it created, with developers, it created, I'm trying to make sure I get here. Why it might not have a really huge wholesale change in their calculus is because oftentimes they are as much beholden to, say, the financiers' concerns as they were the parking requirements at the local governments. So what they were talking to their teams about, the folks who actually are the banks that are financing these projects, is that some of them are concerned about lending to a project with no parking. So as much as there is a local policy plays a role, there's actually this bigger decision-making network among developers. Some were looking to self-finance a project to show that it could be done so that they could demonstrate that to their financing teams. So, whoops, in the kind of grand scheme, what's our overarching takeaway here? This bill in California, at least, because it had so much ambiguity built into it to ensure its passage through the legislature, is perhaps less far-reaching than proponents promised and, frankly, the opponents feared. There are some cities that are kind of just marginally meddling with those definitions, or they just wholly flout some of the provisions there. But where we saw the most promise and the largest impacts potentially were those cities that were favorably predisposed to parking reform, but are using this law as a nudge, as a shield, or as a springboard, which we are seeing could be pretty darn powerful. With that, I look forward to conversation. Thank you so much for your thoughts and attention.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was great. And yeah, hopefully Paula at the end let us go over the 12:45 in time a little bit here. I for the Q&A, feel free to raise your hand. We also have a few questions in the chat. I'll start with just a general question, because I know a lot of folks in the PRN are citizen advocates, and with so much of the question around parking law moving from the local level to the state level, I'm curious if you can think of ways in which the advocates can be more engaged in what's going on in their state or provincial capitals.
Yeah, so the how advocates, like, how these coalitions can be successful when they transition to state politics or the state arena instead of the local. Sure, absolutely. Okay, good question. I mean, I think there are a lot of probably really experienced advocates on this call that I'd be curious to hear their thoughts about that.
I'll sort of also kind of to add to it, maybe also bring it a little closer to the research. I think we can see with this law, we see a lot of state laws, especially in California, that things get added to it in the process that kind of either render it difficult to implement or very hard to implement. So, engaging with, how do you think people should be engaging with some of those questions of the cleanliness of these laws, and should advocates be thinking of getting into the weeds on these laws as they go through the process, and what should they be looking out for?
Certainly. So I just outlined kind of how those ambiguities that got added to this is kind of more of a political policy process, political branching out. So I'm going to be hypothesizing a little bit here, but hopefully future research. Um, all of those ambiguities really come into play. What we documented was how those are coming into play in implementation. And so with pieces of this law that were added for political viability through the state legislative process, essentially a bigger, more clear-cut bill would have maybe not actually passed. And so at least that's kind of what we've heard from certain advocates is those pieces about near transit and this and all of those details and ambiguities made it more politically palatable and let it pass. And then what often happens with bills that are a bit ambiguous, we've seen this in other areas, like accessory dwelling unit law has really happened, this kind of life course in California, pretty ambiguous, not used much. And then something a law gets passed and then there's policy innovation that happens in the years that follow, so it gets tightened up, some of the ambiguities get struck, and it becomes a more powerful law, and so will that happen here? Who knows, but if it did, it would, I think, certainly um, make this law as more this parking reform broader reaching, and just there'd be less wiggle room. Essentially, that wiggle room lets it's really, really hard for this a state to know what cities are doing and if parking like they don't know if parking that's being supplied is because the developer wants to do that or if because there is, say, metaphorical arm twisting or preemptive avoidance of arm twisting as developers work through that permitting process with a city. It's really hard to know to enforce this law, is what I'm getting at. Um, as it gets more clear and those ambiguities are removed or not inserted into the law, it would make it a much more clear cut, stronger preemption, is what I would say. Um, but it's a trade-off between getting it through the legislative body and kind of the back end actual policy implementation. That's a trade-off, and it's one that's documented really well in the policy world of using ambiguity to diffuse conflict,
Mhm.
um, is used a
Yeah,
lot
that's
as
great.
a strategy.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question from Eric about if you interviewed any below market rate developers and if you get a sense that their goals and incentives are any different than market rate developers.
Yeah, I did. And so what really came out in talking to folks who were capital A affordable or below market rate, as we'd say in California, this bill, AB 2097, they very clearly said that one is helpful, but there's sort of how I see it is like this layering of sedimentary rock of housing legislation in California right now. So it is one of many, but for the developers that are doing below market rate development, there have already been laws that have reduced parking requirements. Um, and so this bill honestly wasn't a big deal for them. Um,
Great.
their parking requirements had already been relieved by way of other bills. Um,
That's great. One question I also had is around the shield, and this
mhm.
may be a more of a future research thing, especially when thinking specifically about AB 2097. It may take a few election cycles, but I'm curious if from your conversations with cities that are sort of seeing the state law as a shield, if the shield is working and it feels like they're able to actually successfully deflect any of the negative feelings they're getting from their constituents to the state law, or if they still are feeling a little bit of a political burn and blowback from implementing these state laws.
The city representatives that we spoke with, this was in the first year or two after the law was passed, so they were still feeling like that shield was holding and actually holding very well. They were able to say, like, they had mayors or city council members who very clearly deflected the blame to their state lawmaker. So they said, if you don't like this, go talk to Sacramento, which is where California's capital state house is. Go talk to your state senator. This is out of our hands now because this is state law. And uh, I think the shield on the other side, the cities that were saying like, oh, we're gonna nickel and dime, so to speak, exactly what, half a mile is from our transit station. We're gonna draw it this way, and we're gonna make it really tight and small. Those technical debates are getting better worked out, and there's more precedent, and there's now a guidance, like an advisory document put out by the housing department, the state housing department, that says here's how you should do it. Um, those shields are kind of getting a little bit more worn down, but so far the other side of that shield that is seeming to hold. However, the cities that are using those shields pretty like strongly to implement their local housing plans, they are certainly concerned about there being a shift in winds of state policy as they go through this. Like that's what they're relying on. So about they're concerned about like where will this go too far and where will people actually go talk to their state senator, when they say you can't talk to us, go talk to Sacramento. Like at one point, well, they actually do that. But so far that has not yet happened.
Great. Well, feel free to drop more questions in the chat or raise your hand. I'll ask one sort of more follow up on this in terms of the types of cities that you talk to. Obviously, makes sense that you want to keep things anonymous, and obviously won't drill down into those details. But I'm curious if you saw a sense, California has a lot of big cities, some over a million, some into the hundreds of thousands, with large planning departments, transportation departments, and even staff of politicians having multiple staff members. And then you have a lot of smaller cities that have maybe one or two planners, maybe just a city manager, and then of course the elected officials in those cities oftentimes are volunteers and are not going to be spending all this time digging through all this case law. Same with the city attorneys in these smaller cities. I'm curious if you've seen trying to even out things irrespective of the politics, if you've seen a difference in how a big city with a large staff and a large kind of mechanism around this thinks about this versus a smaller city that may not have that same kind of institutional manpower to either fight this or implement it in kind of wonky ways. I'm curious what that experience was like.
Absolutely, and thank you for that question, because I would say a lot of that obstacle feeling, there are small cities, as you said, where there's maybe one planner in the entire department, and another thing coming down from the state where they have to draw a map. They're like, another thing the state's telling us to do. Like removing parking requirements seems like it's taking something off their plate, but drawing up the map and actually implementing it, especially because it's an accretion of many different housing laws that all have slightly different versions of that long list that I showed you. The sense of it being an obstacle, of the state law being an obstacle, is very much like, I now have to do this other thing. I have to implement this new law that the state keeps rolling out. And so resources of the cities definitely plays a role in the ability to respond, and like the nature of that response. Cities with more resources, at least it's not an obstacle in the like a person who is spending their limited hours of their 40-hour work week. It's they have the obstacle is not because it's like I have to squeeze this into my duties as assigned, which also might include like working the counter. Yeah, so that and just like the technical prowess, do they even have kind of the software they would need to draw this? Like when city drew their maps, they printed their maps and drew them by hand. They got out a compass and dropped their maps down and did it that way, and then sent them to their regional agency and said, please make these maps for the planned network, the planned transit network. So certainly this is that like the, there's so many debates happening at every level of like consultants and cities and MPOs and the state departments. They're all talking about like, how do you measure this? And so if you're a little tiny planning agency somewhere in a remote part of California, like this is not an easy thing to figure out.
That circle printed out map with the compass, that's an incredible anecdote. I sort of landed on that weird and hard quote
Yeah.
from one of the people you talked to, of just of these things being really difficult for cities to implement. And yeah, you mentioned sort of the politics of it, making it really hard to just have like a clean sort of rule around this. But I think having followed a bill through the legislative process last
Mhm.
year, kind of understanding how these things get added in little by little, and without much in the way of time and research into what each little caveat and carve out and detail kind of means for the implementing agencies, it sort of makes it seem like that
Mhm.
legislators should be prioritizing this cleanness, what it sounds like with the politics of it. It's not an easy thing to do.
It's a balance, yeah. And I
Yeah.
will say that burden of figuring this all out is also felt by the developers because a lot of developers are individuals. Like they're not necessarily a big firm that has an entire legal department.
Yeah.
So they don't know unless they go and hire a land use lawyer, but that's very expensive. And they tend, and why kind of one of the themes here is developers often said that they tended to try to be as collaborative and non-litigious as possible because they want to maintain their relationships for all of their current and future projects that they might send through the city. So they don't want to burn bridges.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think also thinking about actually something I'm working on right now is a local legislation that's implementing state law, and you know some and the in our city in San Francisco, it was a state law around development fees, and the city already follows it. It has sort of chosen to proactively follow it, and there is this question on a lot of these state laws. Some of them are a little bit more explicit than others, but like does the city actually need to pass an ordinance? Do they actually need to redo the zoning to implement it? Versus can this just be something that is the state law? And that puts a lot of the burden, as you said, on the developers. Because if you're in a city
Mhm.
that doesn't update their zoning code to reflect this law, then you leave a
Right.
developer to go out and draw those circles themselves, and
Exactly.
then maybe get into a place where they have to kind of go back and forth, or inform a counter level
Mhm.
permit planner about the state law and the fact that the city is going to be violating it by requiring them to build this parking.
Precisely. Yep.
Right.
Yep. And if you're a
Awesome.
developer interested in getting your project permitted, you don't want to
Yeah.
make enemies at that city.
No, definitely don't. Well, thank you, Amy.
Thanks, everyone,
Uh,
and feel free to reach out with any questions. I'm always happy to chat.